Hello, welcome back to Moffett Field. Today we're covering the Battle of Bryansk. We're in turn 4 of a pretty interesting game, so I thought I'd bring it to you straight from the front. We actually had to stop the game because it was getting late and we had to go to work the next day. But we will pick it up probably in a day or two and see how this game and this battle in particular pan out. As you can see, the Russians and the Germans are pretty evenly stacked up against each other in R5. There's a Russian fighter and the 74th still sitting in. There's the 13th sitting in R7, and there's the 74th sitting in Russia itself with another build on the way. Given that there's these Russians, sitting here as reinforcements, if Germany is unsuccessful in this, it's probably the game. The Japanese, I'll show you in a bit, have their own problems, it looks like. There's a naval battle that we'll see how that pans out. But we'll cover this. I'll put this on the battle board and we'll look at this in a little more detail. But why don't we see how we got here first of all? I'll cover a little bit from what I can remember of the 4 turns leading up to this, and then I also have some of the movement operation boards that I can refer back to, some pictures of those. So I may stop the video occasionally and put those up on the screen and talk through those movements as well. So how did we get here? The game pretty much started off with the Germans advancing through the Caucasus. So pretty much the first moves out of Germany were south through the Caucasus, and a movement towards Russia as well. The goal, of course, was to help secure India through Iran. And actually, the Japanese and Germans should have secured India last time, and I actually presented this incorrectly on my Moffett Field Gazette. I actually said that Japan takes India, but I forgot that they actually did not take India, that this 63rd held on by their fingernails and were able to prevent the Germans and Japanese from taking India and inflicting 5 stress points, which would have sent the British down another level into dysfunctional, maybe even supply lines disrupted. So, still a battle going on in India. A quick interruption here to take a look at the German and Italian movement cards. One can see that the 5 Navy, 3rd Navy were planning on moving to A3. I believe that order was canceled. I don't think they were able to get there. The Air Forces moved into A6 to try and take out the UK Navy. And as mentioned, the land forces moved into R6 to take out the Caucasus on turn 1. Looking at the Italian card, it's pretty much M3. And that's where the defeat of the Italian Navy occurred in turn 1. I'm going to go back over here to the Middle East. Not much going on in Africa. The British have not been really building down here. This is the first build in the game, I think, in South Africa. There just hasn't been much threat, and actually the threat was neutralized very early on. The Italians launched their fleet into M3. And I think I have a picture of that. I'll put it up. There was a large naval battle here in M3. And the result was that the Italians, who were obviously going to do a pretty quick amphibious landing, lost their entire amphibious assault on, I think it was the first turn out of the gate. The Axis almost quit at that point, but continued on and actually have done pretty well, getting pretty deep into Russia. This 75th just split off last turn to go and try and retake Iran back. The Russians have been sending small units of 1 or 2 units down here to harass the Germans, try to inflict some stress. They did send the Germans down to the first level. The Japanese, Russians, and British are with them as well. So the Italians took a pretty big setback early on in the game. We had the usual A6 naval battles. The Luftwaffe was sent in, did some damage, I think, on some of these units, the British units that start out there. The British are building a sub and some airplanes, keeping a stack here to prevent sea lion. I don't think there's a threat of sea lion at this point, but there was, there's always that threat coming out of the gate. And of course, the Americans are ferrying units across, up through Greenland, up through Canada. And there was a pretty good video by Payne State, Painstate. He does a pretty good summary of the map and the significance of some of these territories. So I'd recommend go watch his video. He does a 30 minutes on just the map without any units on it, and just kind of does a pretty good introduction. So these planes, obviously, we're still in mid turn of turn 4. So these planes are still on their way. But again, no big surprise here what the Americans are doing. What else we got here? Not much going on in the Pacific. We do have activity over here near Tokyo. There wasn't a lot that happened down here. Usual battle, P-18, seeing some British fleets. But as you can see, not many units have moved off of these islands. The Japanese just built these 3 or 4 subs. The Americans have moved their fleet in and sank a fleet last turn. Did some pretty good, I think the Japanese start with 3 stacks of ships. One of those was sunk last turn here in P1. The Japanese have since moved the remaining bulk of their fleet up into P1 to take on the Americans. This is kind of a first in Asia for us as well. The British out of Canada came over, the US 31st. I believe they start in Alaska, Hawaii, and the Aleutians combined, I think, to form this stack. They had a choice: land in Japan and battle that out, but in the end decided to land in Manchuria in J3 and put some additional pressure on the Japanese here. Obviously, the Japanese have broken the Molotov Pact and moved in. They've subsequently moved back here a little bit to counter the American threat in Russia. The Chinese did an initial burst into Beijing to try and take Beijing. Did some damage, but in the end, the Japanese held Beijing because as the Chinese, you want to try to get Beijing so that you can build artillery and use the iron that accumulates every turn, 2 per turn, I think is what it is. The Chinese are building 2 to 3 units per turn, as long as the Japanese haven't penetrated too far into China. So 2 or 3 each turn, drop those in, take a couple of territories, harass the Japanese over here if possible. And I think that's about a summary of the board in turn 4 and a little bit of how we got here. Now I'll rack these up on the battle board and we can see what they look like next to each other. Before we go look at the battle board for turn 4, I want to show the results of turn 1. So we're back to turn 1 now. Because I think it's interesting to show what happened to the Italians and the British. So on the top row, a little bit happened to the Chinese. The British ended up losing a carrier, a cruiser, a sub or two, and the two British battleships. They're in the wrong row at the moment here on this battle board. They're in the Soviet row, but they lost those two battleships as well. The Soviets lost their navy, of course, in A6. And but the main row to look at is the second from the bottom, the Italians. You can see the entire invasion fleet. I think it's 115 and 114. And then, of course, most of the Italian Navy as well. Firstly, though, I want to talk a little bit about what happened here in turn for the movement bid. The Russians could have either moved into Moscow or tried to pin the Germans in Bryansk. It was a gamble. Both sides bid 5 oil, but the Russians won you turn over the discs. The Russians won the random draw and moved first. So they were able to move into R5 and pin the Germans down. Actually, the Germans had not been planning on taking Russia quite yet, taking Moscow. They were going to go out and cause some mayhem, cause some stress, and retake some of these other territories. Take Russia 2, Russia 3, Russia 4, spread out again, secure the Russian territories, and then go for Moscow. But as I said, they lost the bid, and Russia was able to pin them in Bryansk. So now we'll go to the battle board. Here are the units stacked up next to each other, a little easier to see. There's 1, 2, 4, 6 tanks over here. I think there's 7 tanks on the Russian side. The Germans outnumber the Russians in terms of artillery, which could be a detriment the next turn unless the Russians can bring in some more artillery. And they have like 3 on the build in Russia, so they should be able to. Air Force wise, looks like the Allies have a slight advantage in the Air Force. So this will be an interesting battle, and we'll see how it plays out. One of the things I've been kind of learning odds-wise in the game is that, and I haven't put this into a spreadsheet or anything yet, I'm still trying to get out my statistics book and relearn probabilities, multiple permutations and combinations. But once you reach 30 air dice, you have to figure how many do you want to keep in the ground, how many additional might you want in the air. You figure you're going to lose a couple fighters. So where is the enemy going to take those fighters from? Are they going to take them from the ground? Are they going to take them from the air? So there's some mental calculation that has to go on when you count up to 30. Obviously, if you hit 30, you want to, and you have 40 dice possible, you don't want to keep, put everybody in the air block. Why not use them in the ground once you hit that 30 dice maximum? Same kind of goes for the ground forces. Bring in more than 30. Bring in more units that produce more than 30 dice in case you lose some. Keep them behind as reinforcements. Those are things we're still learning and getting the feel for. The gut feel is to just bring in as many units as possible. But then what happens? They possibly get pinned. You can't reallocate them, and they just get ground into microplastic by every time each round of die every turn. So I think there's a balance here between how many units to actually bring in, because you may not need them all, just enough to capture the territory, but don't bring in too many that you get pinned down and all your commands, these are the commands, these top tokens, all your commands are sitting in one space on the board and you can't build or you can't do anything else. So again, we're learning those kind of mechanics and nuances to the game. Pretty interesting. When you combine that with the secret moves, with the different types of units, it's actually becoming a pretty complex mental puzzle that one has to think about. Add in the stress. How many medals are you going to get each turn? How much stress might you get inflicted upon you? There's a lot of variables here. What else? Just to take a quick look at where we are stress-wise, you can see the Russians have a lot of medals, but they also have a lot of stress on the board. I think they're actually going to get a stress point perhaps at the end of this turn. The Germans are in pretty good condition. The Italians are in pretty good condition. The Japanese are not looking too good. They're about halfway there. The Americans don't ever really much need to worry. And the British usually have to worry quite a bit. But so far, it doesn't look like there's too much threat yet of going down another economic stress level on the big board. And when I'm talking about the economic stress level, I'm talking about this circle here where you lose different advantages. You lose 3 movements, you lose 3 resources, you lose no rail, and then you move into economic collapse. One thing I'll touch on briefly here too is that the rules say that the player that has the first order, I'm gonna hit the battle board. The rules say that the person that's first in order on the turn order has to set up on the battle board first. We kind of struggle with that because whoever sets up second, we think get an advantage, because then you can adjust your air force maybe to shoot down things or yeah, so it seems like the person that goes second has an advantage. So this is probably the first kind of house rule or modification that we've made. There's 2 battle boards, set up independently, set up secretly, so that you don't know what the other person is doing. Of course, you need to know how many units they have, and they can tell you that. But we're trying out secret battle board setup. And yeah, they're next to each other. You can look over and see it, but we trust each other. I guess you could set it up like Battleship and put a barrier here so that you actually couldn't see. But I think it's pretty good because it adds another level of secrecy. And why should someone who's first in the turn order potentially be penalized in the battles? So just something to think about. Let me know your thoughts on that if you think that's a good idea. We're trying it out, and so far it seems to work okay. All right, so I think I'm going to cut it off there. And when we finish the battle for Bryansk, I will finish this video. Until then, wish everyone good luck here. Take care. So what I decided to do here is to make this a 2-part video. This will be part 1. When I resolve all the battles in turn 4 and see how it turns out, I will post another video, battle for Bryansk, as part 2. Thank you for watching.